In 1864, the ballroom at Wentworth Woodhouse glowed with gaslight as 2,000 guests danced across floors of Italian marble. The orchestra played from an elevated gallery. Champagne flowed. The women wore jewels that caught the light like trapped stars. The occasion was the coming-of-age ball for Viscount Milton, the young heir to the earldom. No one in that crowded room could have imagined that within 3 generations the entire East Wing would sit empty and crumbling, abandoned to decay, and threatened not with demolition, but with something far more sinister: the systematic destruction of its grounds and the collapse of its foundations through open-cast coal mining. The most ambitious architectural project of the Georgian era, a house of vast scale, reputedly containing a room for every day of the year, would become a symbol of everything lost when a family's ambition exceeds its wisdom. But that story is incomplete. The real narrative of Wentworth Woodhouse is not about inevitable decline. It is about how one house became a battlefield between progress and preservation, between the Fitzwilliam family clinging to the past and a post-war nation demanding the future, and ultimately between class warfare and cultural salvation. What most people think they know about grand estates is simple. Wealthy families built them. Wealthy families maintained them. And when the money ran out, the families left and the houses crumbled. But Wentworth Woodhouse proves that narrative is far too easy. This house did not fail because of incompetence. It failed because of excellence. It failed because a family built something so magnificent, so demanding, so ambitious, that no amount of ordinary wealth could sustain it. And when the crisis came, not in the Depression, but after World War II, when an ideological government took power with a desire to erase the very concept of aristocratic privilege, the forces arrayed against it were not simply economic. They were political. They were about whether a vast country house had any right to exist in a modern democratic state. And they were, most viscerally, about coal. The story of Wentworth Woodhouse begins not with the building itself, but with the family that decided to build it. In 1724, Thomas Watson Wentworth inherited land near Rotherham in Yorkshire. He was already one of the richest men in England. His family had made their fortune in banking and landholding. But Thomas wanted something more than wealth. He wanted to announce his status through architecture. He wanted to build a house that would declare his family's importance, not just to his neighbors, but to history itself. So in 1724, he began construction on a house that would eventually contain 2 massive facades, each 500 feet long. One wing would face west toward the old Jacobean house. One would face east toward the future. The house would be so large that from certain angles you could not see where it ended. It would simply disappear into its own vastness. The design was revolutionary for its time. 2 houses in one, Baroque magnificence on the west front, Palladian elegance on the east. It was not just a house. It was a statement about power and permanence. It was a bet that the wealth of the Fitzwilliam family would last forever. The architectural ambition was extraordinary. The house would contain hundreds of rooms spread across multiple wings, connected by corridors so long that servants needed time to walk from one end to the other. There would be a ballroom large enough for 2,000 people. There would be reception rooms, drawing rooms, morning rooms, evening rooms. Different spaces for different purposes, at different times of day. There would be kitchens so distant from the dining room that the food would arrive cold. There would be servant staircases, and public staircases, and hidden staircases. There would be libraries and galleries and chambers designed specifically for entertaining. The sheer scale of it was not about luxury. It was about power. It was about power. It was about demonstrating that Thomas Watson Wentworth could afford to build something so impractical, so expensive to maintain, so utterly divorced from any logical human need, that it could only exist as a statement. "I have so much money," this house declared, "that I can waste resources on this scale and never miss them." But here is where the paradox begins. To maintain a house this size, you do not need wealth. You need continuous, uninterrupted wealth. You need wealth that can be counted not just in pounds, but in decades of unbroken prosperity. You need a family that does not make mistakes. You need sons who understand investment. You need daughters who marry men with more wealth, not less. You need the agricultural economy to remain stable. You need the Industrial Revolution not to transform society so completely that the very concept of a grand country estate becomes obsolete. And you need, most critically, to ensure that the land beneath your house does not contain something more valuable than the house itself. You need the coal to stay in the ground. By 1790, when the house was finally completed, Wentworth Woodhouse had cost more than any private individual had ever spent on a residential building. The Fitzwilliam family had become famous not just for the size of their estate, but for the cost of their ambition. The Fitzwilliams were coal kings. They owned the land above some of Yorkshire's richest coal seams. This wealth, the coal beneath their feet, had paid for the house. And for the next 150 years, the house worked exactly as intended. It was the center of a working estate. The family employed hundreds of servants. They kept the gardens immaculate. They hosted balls and dinners and hunts. The house represented everything about the old aristocratic order, everything about inherited wealth and inherited power. For a century and a half, Wentworth Woodhouse was not a burden. It was a triumph, and the coal beneath the estate continued to generate the wealth that sustained it. Then came the late 19th century, and everything changed. The financial situation had begun to shift. The agricultural depression was hitting the landed estates of England hard. The coal industry, which had enriched the Yorkshire region and paid for Wentworth Woodhouse, was starting to move elsewhere. The concept of maintaining hundreds of servants seemed increasingly anachronistic. More importantly, income tax was increasing. The government was beginning to tax inheritance. The very legal structures that had allowed great estates to persist across centuries were being dismantled by a slowly democratizing nation. Consider what it meant to maintain Wentworth Woodhouse in this period. The cost of heating the house in winter was astronomical. The building was so vast that you could not heat it uniformly. Families would close off entire wings and live in a small portion of the building. But even the small portion was enormous. The cost of maintaining the roof alone was substantial. This was a building with acres of slate that needed constant repair. The cost of maintaining the gardens was extraordinary. The kitchen staff, the housemaids, the footmen, the gardeners, the groundskeepers, the stable staff, hundreds of people whose salaries and food and housing all had to be paid for by the family's income. And that income, which had seemed unlimited in 1860, was starting to feel constrained by 1900. The 6th Earl Fitzwilliam, William Thomas Spencer, Wentworth Fitzwilliam, inherited the estate in 1857 and would preside over the house during the period of its greatest challenge and greatest glory. William Fitzwilliam was not a stupid man. He was cultured and intelligent, and he understood the forces arrayed against his inheritance. But he also understood something else. He could not simply abandon the house. The estate generated income from its tenants and its coal rights. It was the center of a functioning community. And more fundamentally, it represented everything his family had built. To let it deteriorate would be to declare that the family's power was waning. It would be to admit that the world had changed in ways they could not control. So William Fitzwilliam made a choice. He invested heavily in maintaining the house. He modernized certain systems. Gaslight was installed, then electricity, then modern plumbing. He updated the furnishings. He hosted lavish events. The famous ball of 1864, the coming-of-age celebration for his son, Viscount Milton, would become legendary, a last great gesture of Fitzwilliam power and wealth. But each of these improvements cost money. Each required decisions. And each decision was made in the shadow of a larger economic reality that was slowly constricting the family's options. The servants were becoming harder to find and more expensive to employ. The agricultural income was declining. The coal revenues were uncertain, and the government kept raising taxes. By 1908, The situation had become clear to anyone willing to see it. The Fitzwilliam family could not afford to maintain Wentworth Woodhouse indefinitely. They could afford it for a few more decades, perhaps, but the trajectory was downward. The question was not if the family would have to make changes, but when and how severe those changes would be. William Fitzwilliam seemed to understand this. He began to carefully consider what could be done. One option was to sell the house. But to whom? A house this size had almost no market. It was too expensive to maintain, too idiosyncratic to convert to another use. Selling it meant finding another wealthy family willing to take on the same burden. Another option was to gradually let it decline, closing off rooms, laying off servants, letting the decay accelerate until it was no longer worth maintaining. A third option was to donate it to some institution that might find a use for it. And a fourth option. The one that the Fitzwilliams eventually attempted was to simply keep going, to maintain the house as perfectly as possible for as long as possible, and to hope that the economic situation would somehow improve, or that a solution would present itself before it was too late. But solutions do not present themselves. They have to be engineered. And in the case of Wentworth Woodhouse, the solution came not from the family, but from history itself. In 1939, the Second World War began, and war, it turned out, could do something that decades of economic pressure could not do. It could actually justify the existence of a vast country house. Wentworth Woodhouse was requisitioned by the British government. The family was asked to leave. The house would be used by military intelligence services. Suddenly, those hundreds of rooms had a purpose beyond display. The vast wings could house officers. The kitchens could feed personnel. The reception rooms could become offices. The war had given the house a function beyond aristocratic grandeur. It had given the Fitzwilliam family a kind of reprieve. The house was being used. It was contributing to the war effort, and the family would eventually be able to reclaim it after the war ended. Except reclaiming Wentworth Woodhouse proved to be far more complicated than simply returning to the status quo ante. The war ended in 1945, but the world that emerged was fundamentally different from the world that had existed in 1939. The old aristocratic order was crumbling. Working men who had fought in the war were demanding representation in government. Women were demanding the right to vote. The very concept of inherited wealth and inherited power was being questioned in ways it never had been before. And most immediately, the cost of maintaining a grand estate had increased dramatically. Wages had risen. The cost of materials had risen. Taxes were higher than ever. The government was now controlled by the Labour Party under Clement Attlee, and they were looking at ways to break up the large estates and redistribute resources. It seemed like the world had turned against everything that Wentworth Woodhouse represented. The family returned to the house in 1945, but the relief was short-lived. Within months, it became clear that the pre-war economic model was gone. The servants could not be rehired at pre-war rates. The government was introducing an inheritance tax that would take a significant portion of the estate when the current earl died. The coal industry was in flux. Agricultural income had declined so far that it barely covered the costs of maintaining the land. And the house itself, which had been used by the military during the war, was showing signs of damage. Repairs would be expensive. But there was another threat emerging, one that was far more concrete and far more directly dangerous than financial decline. The British government, under Labour control, was desperate for coal. The nation needed fuel. The mines of Yorkshire represented a critical national resource. And beneath Wentworth Woodhouse, beneath the gardens and the grounds and the very foundations of the house, lay some of the richest coal seams in England. In 1946, Manny Shinwell, the Labour Minister of Fuel and Power, made a decision. The coal beneath Wentworth Woodhouse would be extracted. It would be extracted through open-cast mining, which meant that instead of digging straight down, miners would strip away everything above the coal. The topsoil, the gardens that had taken centuries to develop, the woodlands, and finally, the earth that supported the very foundations of the house. It was an act of extraordinary vindictiveness. Shinwell, A working-class man who had fought his way up through the ranks of the labor movement saw Wentworth Woodhouse as everything wrong with the old Britain. It represented aristocratic privilege, inherited wealth, the assumption that some people were born to rule and others born to serve. And now the government had the power to destroy it in the name of progress, in the name of fuel for the nation, in the name of making the old order obsolete. The Fitzwilliams watched in horror as the mining began. One by one, the gardens disappeared. The woodland was cleared. The parkland that had stretched for miles was torn up by mining equipment. Thousands of tons of earth were moved. And with each day of mining, the threat to the house itself grew more acute. The foundations were being undermined. Literally, the earth was sinking. Structural cracks appeared in the walls. It seemed only a matter of time before the house would collapse entirely, not from bombs or fire, but from the systematic removal of the very ground it stood on. This was class warfare made physical. This was the new Britain literally tearing apart the symbols of the old order. And it was also, from a certain perspective, justice. Working-class men had spent generations working in the mines that had made the Fitzwilliams wealthy. Now, finally, those mines were being reclaimed for the benefit of the nation. The coal would heat homes for working families. It would power industry. The coal that had been locked beneath Wentworth Woodhouse for centuries, enriching a single family, would be extracted and distributed. The aristocrats would lose their wealth. The nation would gain its resources. Progress, as the labor government saw it, required sacrifice. And they were quite happy to sacrifice Wentworth Woodhouse on the altar of that progress. But what the government did not anticipate was that some people would object, not on behalf of the Fitzwilliams, but on behalf of the house itself. A coalition of preservationists, architects, and heritage campaigners began to argue that Wentworth Woodhouse was not merely a symbol of privilege. It was a work of art. It was an important example of Georgian and Victorian architecture. It was a record of craftsmanship and ambition that, regardless of who had built it, deserved to be preserved. These arguments were not obviously persuasive. After all, what did it matter if the nation lost one grand house? Were there not too many grand houses already? Was not the whole point of the modern state to move beyond this kind of ostentatious display? But the preservationists had something that the government did not have. They had time. And they had determination. And they had a slowly growing recognition that perhaps the decision to permit open-cast mining beneath a significant historical building had been made too quickly. Perhaps people were beginning to wonder. There was something valuable about preserving some connection to the past, even if you did not want to live that past. Perhaps the fact that a house had existed for 200 years and had been built by someone's skill and ambition meant that it was worth saving, even if you rejected the social system that had created it. Perhaps the house and the old order it represented were not the same thing. Perhaps you could destroy one without destroying the other. By 1950, the immediate threat of complete destruction had been averted. The open-cast mining continued, but with modifications designed to minimize damage to the house itself. But the long-term threat remained acute. The house was still owned by the Fitzwilliam family, but they could not afford to maintain it. The government was not going to help. The preservationists had succeeded in stopping complete destruction, but they had not succeeded in solving the fundamental problem. How do you maintain a vast country house in a world that no longer believes vast country houses should exist? The family made a series of decisions over the next few decades. Portions of the house were let out. The east wing was occupied by a training college for teachers. Other rooms were rented out. Various schemes were attempted to generate income from the property. The family retreated into a smaller section of the building. Gradually, the vast majority of the rooms were simply closed off. The family walked past closed doors, knowing that behind those doors lay rooms that had not been entered in years. Rooms where furniture sat under dust covers. Rooms where the wallpaper was slowly fading. Rooms where the decay was accelerating because there was no heat, no light, no one to maintain them. Between 1950 and 1999, Wentworth Woodhouse existed in a kind of limbo. The immediate threat of destruction had passed. but the house was dying slowly. The family was trying to maintain it but did not have the resources. The preservationists were trying to save it but did not have the authority or the money. And the government was willing to prevent outright destruction, but not willing to help with preservation. The house existed, but it was not being lived in. It was not being used. It was simply deteriorating year by year, decade by decade. The minds that had created the wealth to build the house had now destroyed the landscape around it. The foundations that had supported 2 centuries of aristocratic life were literally crumbling. The great house was becoming a ruin, not through warfare or natural disaster, but through the slow, inexorable logic of economic change and historical transformation. Then, in 1999, something unexpected happened. A businessman named Clifford Newbold purchased the estate. He was not a Fitzwilliam descendant. He was not a preservationist with deep pockets and a romantic vision of the past. He was a businessman who saw potential, but Newbold, despite his resources, discovered what the Fitzwilliams had known for decades. You cannot simply will a house this large back to life. The costs were staggering. The damage was extensive. And the project required not just money but vision, determination, and community support. By 2014, that vision began to take shape. A coalition formed, but this time not divided between those who wanted to save the house and those who wanted to destroy it. This time, the coalition was united. It was led not by an aristocratic heir, but by a local businesswoman named Julie Kenny and heritage campaigners like Marcus Binney of Save Britain's Heritage. They understood something that neither the Labour government of 1946 nor the Fitzwilliam family of 1950 had fully grasped, that a building can change meaning, that a house built as a symbol of aristocratic privilege can be transformed into something else entirely, that preservation and progress are not mutually exclusive, that you can demolish a social system without demolishing the buildings that system created. They formed the Wentworth Woodhouse Preservation Trust. They raised millions in grants and donations, arguing that this palace did not belong to a single family anymore. It belonged to the history of the nation. In 2017, the trust officially acquired the house for £7 million. They did not promise to turn it back into a private aristocratic residence. That world was gone and no one wanted it back. Instead, they promised to turn the house into a living center for the North, a place where the craftsmanship of the past would be preserved and celebrated and used to train the apprentices of the future, where people from all backgrounds could visit and understand something about how their nation had been built, where the architectural achievement could be honored separately from the social system that had created it. What does the story of Wentworth Woodhouse tell us? What can we learn from a vast country house that almost was destroyed, not by bombs or fire, but by the deliberate policy of a government that saw it as an enemy of progress? What can we learn from a preservation campaign that succeeded not because it was defending the old order, but because it understood that the old order and the old buildings were not the same thing? The first lesson is about scale. Ambition without wisdom is dangerous. Thomas Watson Wentworth, centuries before the Fitzwilliams, built a house so vast that it could only be maintained by the relentless prosperity of a family line and a nation. When that prosperity faltered, when the industrial logic that had sustained it changed, the house became a burden. But the burden was not just financial. It was existential. The family who had built the house as a monument to their own importance found that the house had become a monument to the fragility of their power. They had created something so large that it outlasted their ability to control it. And when they could no longer control it, the government came and began to tear apart the ground beneath it. The second lesson is about the relationship between the past and the present. The decision to permit open-cast mining beneath Wentworth Woodhouse made sense from a certain perspective. Post-war Britain needed coal. Working-class people needed fuel to heat their homes. The minerals beneath the estate belonged to the nation, not to the Fitzwilliams. From a certain angle, extracting that coal was justice. It was returning to the people what had been extracted from their labor for centuries. But the decision was also vindictive. It was made not just on practical grounds, but on ideological grounds. The Labour government wanted to erase the symbols of the old order. They wanted to demonstrate that the world had changed, and what better way to do that than to literally tear apart one of the greatest symbols of aristocratic power. What changed over the next 70 years was not the economic logic of mining. What changed was that people began to understand that you could accept the justice of that logic while still preserving the buildings, that you could extract the coal and save the house. That progress does not require destruction, that the future does not require erasing the past. The third lesson is about the role of ordinary people in preserving history. The preservationists who fought to save Wentworth Woodhouse in the 1940s and 50s were not powerful in the way the Fitzwilliams were powerful. They did not have government backing. They did not have the authority to make final decisions. What they had was a conviction that the house was worth saving, and they had the determination to keep arguing decade after decade until circumstances changed enough that their argument could prevail. And eventually, nearly 70 years after the mining began, circumstances did change. The coal was mostly extracted. The immediate threat of collapse had diminished, and a new generation arrived with both the resources and the vision to reimagine what the house could become. The fourth lesson is about the unexpected resilience of physical things. The house was abandoned. It was neglected. The ground beneath it was systematically torn away. Portions of it fell into severe decay. And yet, the fundamental structure remained. The materials that had been chosen centuries before, the stone, the brick, the slate, had lasted. The craftsmanship that had gone into the building meant that even when it was not being maintained, it did not simply collapse. It endured, and because it endured, it could eventually be saved. The house outlasted the aristocracy that built it. It outlasted the government that tried to destroy it. It outlasted the economic systems that had sustained it and then abandoned it. It simply endured, waiting for someone to decide that it was worth the effort to keep it alive. And the fifth lesson, perhaps the most important one, is about what a house actually is. Wentworth Woodhouse began as a statement of power. It was a monument to the wealth and ambition of the Fitzwilliam family. It became a symbol of a family's importance. It became a working estate that employed hundreds of people. It became a space where the rituals of aristocratic life played out, the balls, the hunts, the ceremonies of inherited privilege. It became a military facility. It became a target for governmental destruction. It became a burden that a family could no longer bear. It became a ruin. And now it is becoming a museum, a cultural heritage site, a center for education and craftsmanship, a place where people can understand something about how the world used to be and how it changed. All of these things. The statement of power, the symbol of family importance, the functioning estate, the military facility, the target of class warfare, the burden, the ruin, the museum. They are all true. They are all part of the house's story, and they are all part of the story of how we, as a society, have changed our relationship to the past. We have learned that you do not have to love a building's origins to value the building itself, that you can despise the social system that created something while still preserving and honoring the craftsmanship that went into it, that progress and preservation are not enemies, but partners in the work of building a future that is honest about its past. When you walk through Wentworth Woodhouse today, you see the restoration work. You see rooms that have been carefully brought back to life. You see other rooms that remain closed off, and decay is still evident. You see the evidence of every era. The Georgian elegance of the West Front, the Palladian refinement of the East, the Victorian updates, the wartime modifications, the evidence of mining damage, the decades of neglect, the ongoing restoration. You can see the entire history of the building in the building itself, and if you look carefully, you can see something else too. You can see the choices that people made, the family that built it out of ambition, the government that tried to destroy it out of ideology, the preservationists who fought to save it out of conviction, the businessmen and women who eventually figured out how to make it work in the modern world. The vast country house almost died. It would have been destroyed, and the world would have continued without it. There are, after all, other country houses. There are other examples of Georgian and Victorian architecture. Wentworth Woodhouse is not unique in its kind. It is unique only in its particular combination of architectural scale, craftsmanship, and the extraordinary historical moment that nearly killed it. But it survived. And it survived. Not because the Fitzwilliam family remained powerful, but because enough people eventually decided that the past was worth preserving alongside the future. That you could destroy the social systems that created grand estates without destroying the estates themselves. That the building itself was not the enemy. The building was just a building. And a building, once made, can be saved or destroyed. But the choice to save it or destroy it is always a choice that the present makes about what kind of relationship it wants to have with the past. Wentworth Woodhouse stands today as evidence that this choice is possible, that you do not have to choose between progress and preservation, that the past can be acknowledged and honored even as you move forward into the future. The vast country house survived, not because someone with aristocratic connections decided to save it. It survived because ordinary people, a businesswoman, a heritage campaigner, local supporters, a community that believed something was worth keeping, made it matter. And in the end, that is what saves things. Not inevitability, not economic logic, not historical forces, but the simple, stubborn human decision that something is worth keeping.